In the spring of 1989, the People's Republic of China experienced the most serious challenge to Communist Party authority since the Cultural Revolution. What began in April as memorial gatherings for a deceased party leader evolved into sustained demonstrations demanding political reform, economic accountability, and democratic change. The protests culminated on the night of June 3rd and morning of June 4th, when the government ordered military forces to clear Tiananmen Square and suppress demonstrations across Beijing, resulting in hundreds and possibly thousands of deaths.
A bloody division brought on by the weekend massacre in Tiananmen Square, in which certainly hundreds, probably thousands, were killed.
The events of those 7 weeks in 1989 exposed fundamental contradictions in China's development. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms had produced remarkable growth throughout the 1980s. Living standards improved.
Of all the world's political leaders, Deng Xiaoping has been the least accessible to the press.
Consumer goods became available. Universities expanded. Contact with the outside world increased through trade and academic exchange. Yet this economic opening occurred without corresponding political reform. The Communist Party maintained absolute control over political institutions, media, and civil society. This created tensions that became increasingly difficult to manage. Party officials exploited their positions to profit from the transition to market economics. Corruption was visible, but could not be challenged through political channels. Inflation eroded wages, even as some became wealthy. Students and intellectuals exposed to ideas from abroad, questioned why economic liberalization could not be accompanied by political opening. They observed Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union and asked why China could not follow a similar path. Hu Yaobang died on April 15, 1989, from an apparent heart attack during a Politburo meeting. He had served as General Secretary of the Communist Party until his forced resignation in January 1987, following student protests. He was identified with political reform, having advocated for reassessing party errors, addressing corruption, and expanding political participation. His death resonated with students and intellectuals who viewed him as a symbol of reform suppressed by conservatives. Students at Beijing universities began organizing memorial activities that rapidly moved beyond mourning. Gatherings to lay wreaths and deliver speeches evolved into demands that the government reverse its negative assessment of Hu's political legacy. These demands then broadened into calls for press freedom, democratic reforms, anti-corruption measures, and dialogue with government leaders. On April 18th, several thousand students marched to Tiananmen Square and remained overnight. They presented a petition to the National People's Congress demanding official recognition of student organizations independent of party control, freedom of the press, disclosure of leaders' finances, and formal dialogue about democratic reform.
Chinese leaders have been talking quite a bit about reform. One major event that would signal a change is the redress of the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre.
The government did not respond. Hu Yaobang's official memorial service on April 22nd drew more than 100,000 people to Tiananmen Square. The demonstrators sang the Internationale and presented themselves as patriotic citizens seeking to strengthen the nation. Yet their presence in such numbers, organized independently of party structures, demanding political accountability, represented direct challenge to the fundamental premise of party rule. Following the memorial, many students returned to classes. But on April 26th, the Communist Party newspaper People's Daily published an editorial personally approved by Deng Xiaoping. The editorial characterized the student movement as turmoil orchestrated by people with ulterior motives who were negating Communist Party leadership and the socialist system. The harsh characterization provoked outrage rather than intimidation. On April 27th, between 50,000 and 200,000 students and supporters marched through Beijing in direct defiance. They encountered police cordons, but broke through with minimal violence.
Chinese radio and television carried a number of programs glorifying the People's Liberation Army.
Beijing residents lined the streets offering food, water, and encouragement. This popular support transformed a student movement into broader expression of frustration with corruption, inflation, and lack of political voice. As April turned to May, the protests established continuous presence in Tiananmen Square. Students erected tents and organized supply systems. They formed autonomous student unions independent of official structures. They published newspapers and distributed literature demanding reform. Workers from state enterprises joined. Intellectuals issued supporting statements. Even some government employees and journalists participated. The movement's organization revealed divisions. Different universities competed for leadership. Radical students wanted to maintain pressure. Moderates favored dialogue and compromise. Outside groups attempted to influence direction. The lack of unified command or clear objectives beyond general demands made negotiations difficult even when party reformers sought dialogue. The scheduled visit of Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in mid-May created complications. The visit, intended to normalize Sino-Soviet relations after 3 decades of hostility, would bring international media to Beijing. Students recognized this as opportunity for global attention. The government faced pressure to clear the square before Gorbachev's arrival to avoid diplomatic embarrassment.
This week, state-run media paid a surprising tribute to the former Chinese leader whose death led to the student protests.
On May 13th, several hundred students initiated a hunger strike in Tiananmen Square. The strikers pledged to refuse food until the government agreed to substantive dialogue about democratic reform. This generated enormous sympathy among Beijing residents and national attention. The hunger strike created a humanitarian crisis the government could not ignore. Students refusing food for days suffered medical emergencies. Ambulances transported severe cases to hospitals. Television showed young people carried away on stretchers, images that brought more supporters to the square. When Gorbachev arrived in Beijing on May 15th, crowd estimates ranged from several hundred thousand to over 1 million occupying Tiananmen Square and surrounding areas. The official welcoming ceremony had to be relocated from the square. Scheduled events were disrupted or cancelled.
People just flooded out and physically, with their sheer numbers, simply blocked the road.
International journalists covering the summit focused instead on the protests, broadcasting images of the occupation to global audiences. The government's embarrassment before the world exposed the depth of the crisis. Within the Communist Party leadership, fundamental disagreements emerged. General Secretary Zhao advocated dialogue and concessions. He visited hunger strikers in the square on May 19th, telling them tearfully that the party had come too late to address their concerns. He suggested the party could survive criticism and reform. Premier Peng and other conservatives viewed the protests as existential threat requiring forceful response. They characterized the demonstrations as counter-revolutionary turmoil that would lead to the party's overthrow and China's descent into chaos. They argued concession would be interpreted as weakness and encourage further challenges. Deng Xiaoping sided with the hardliners. His experiences during the Cultural Revolution, when mass mobilization had produced violence and disorder, shaped his conviction that stability required firm party control.
Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader, the 84-year-old godfather of Chinese economic reform, is the subject of twin rumors.
On May 19th, martial law was declared in parts of Beijing. Ziyang was placed under house arrest, where he would remain until his death. Peng assumed effective leadership of the response. The declaration authorized military forces to enter Beijing and clear Tiananmen Square. Approximately 200,000 troops from multiple army units were ordered to move into the city beginning May 19th. When these forces attempted to advance, they encountered massive resistance from Beijing residents. Citizens erected barricades using buses, trucks, and construction materials. They surrounded military vehicles, deflating tires and blocking roads. Crowds gathered at intersections and prevented troop movements through numbers alone. Beijing residents engaged soldiers in conversations, pleading with them not to move against peaceful demonstrators. Some military units found themselves immobilized for days, vehicles surrounded, soldiers uncertain about orders and unwilling to use force against civilians.
Student uprising to a worker uprising is what really scared the Chinese government.
This initial failure had several consequences. It emboldened protesters and created impression the government might back down. It demonstrated that significant segments of Beijing's population opposed using military force. It revealed divisions within the military, yet it also hardened party leadership, who concluded that hesitation had been interpreted as weakness and decisive action was required. During the final week of May, the situation in the square became increasingly complex. Tens of thousands occupied the space in an encampment with its own internal organization. Sanitation deteriorated. Different student groups and outside organizations competed for influence. Some students, exhausted after weeks, advocated leaving. Others insisted on maintaining occupation until the government agreed to reform. On May 30th, students erected a statue they called the Goddess of Democracy, a plaster and foam figure approximately 10 meters tall, resembling the Statue of Liberty. They positioned it facing Mao Zedong's portrait on the Gate of Heavenly Peace. This symbolic confrontation captured the essential nature of the conflict. On the evening of June 3rd, the government ordered military units to advance on Tiananmen Square by whatever means necessary.
China tonight is a country consumed by rage, grief, chaos. It seems to be teetering between a military state and civil war.
This time, soldiers were authorized to use lethal force against civilians who attempted to block their progress. Multiple army units moved toward the square from different directions. The 27th and 38th Group Armies, along with elements from other formations, converged on central Beijing from staging areas in the suburbs. The 27th Group Army, considered more politically reliable, took the lead in the operation. Other units provided support or blocked escape routes. The violence began not in the square itself, but on approach routes, where troops encountered barricades and crowds attempting to prevent their advance. Along Chang'an Avenue, the major east-west thoroughfare running past Tiananmen, armored personnel carriers advanced toward the square shortly after 10 in the evening. Crowds had erected barricades using buses and construction materials. When civilians refused to disperse, soldiers opened fire. The killing spread rapidly across western Beijing. At Muxidi, approximately 3 kilometers west of Tiananmen Square, troops fired into crowds of protesters and residents. Eyewitnesses described sustained automatic weapons fire, cutting down people attempting to block the military advance. Ambulances attempting to reach the wounded came under fire. Bodies lay in the streets as the military column pushed eastward.
Was singing the Internationale to a background of gunfire.
Similar violence occurred along other approach routes. Soldiers fired on crowds at Xidan intersection. Fighting erupted near the Beijing Concert Hall. Throughout western and central Beijing, the sound of gunfire echoed as military units advanced. Some armored vehicles ran over barricades, and people who could not move aside quickly enough. Hospitals across Beijing filled with wounded and dying as the night progressed. Medical personnel at hospitals near the fighting described operating rooms overwhelmed with gunshot casualties. Staff worked through the night attempting to save lives as ambulances continued arriving with more wounded. Some hospitals ran short of blood and medical supplies. Doctors and nurses, exhausted and traumatized, continued treating casualties until dawn. The actual number of dead and wounded remains disputed. The Chinese government has never released casualty figures and continues to deny that a massacre occurred. International estimates, based on hospital records, eyewitness accounts, and diplomatic cables, range from several hundred to several thousand killed. The Red Cross initially reported 2,600 deaths, but later retracted the figure under government pressure. The uncertainty itself reflects the government's successful suppression of information, but the scale of violence was substantial enough that numerous independent accounts documented killings occurring across multiple locations throughout Beijing. By dawn on June 4th, military forces had reached Tiananmen Square and surrounded it. Students who remained were offered opportunity to leave peacefully through a corridor on the southeast side. Most accepted and departed.
In an unprecedented development, members of the Chinese Army's supply department joined the protest.
Whether violence occurred during this evacuation remains contested. The square was cleared by mid-morning. Tents were destroyed. All physical evidence of the 7-week occupation was systematically removed. The photograph captured on June 5th shows a man carrying shopping bags positioning himself before a column of tanks advancing along Chang'an Avenue. He repeatedly blocked their path as they attempted to maneuver around him. This confrontation lasted several minutes. Cameras in hotel windows overlooking the street filmed the scene. The man's identity has never been established despite the image's global recognition. What became of him remains unknown. Some believe he was arrested. Others suggest he escaped. The Chinese government has never acknowledged the incident. Following the crackdown, the government launched a nationwide campaign to arrest protest leaders and suppress dissent. State television broadcast carefully edited footage, emphasizing violence against soldiers while omitting military attacks on civilians. The narrative framed the military action as necessary response to counter-revolutionary rebellion, threatening China's stability. Citizens were encouraged to report protesters to authorities. Thousands were arrested in weeks and months following June 4th. Student leaders who escaped immediate detention fled China, many finding refuge in Western countries. Those captured faced prison sentences, ranging from years to life. Some disappeared into detention without trial. Workers who had organized autonomous unions received particularly harsh treatment. Several were executed. The government characterized the demonstrations as planned conspiracy to overthrow socialism.
Members of a publishing branch of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party.
Rejecting entirely the students' stated objectives. This narrative, enforced through propaganda and censorship, became official history taught in schools and referenced in media. Alternative accounts were systematically suppressed. International reaction was swift and condemnatory. The United States and European nations imposed sanctions targeting military equipment sales and high-level diplomatic contacts. The World Bank and Asian Development Bank suspended loans. The United States Congress passed legislation protecting Chinese students in America from forced return. Yet this isolation proved temporary. Western governments maintained embassy presence and lower-level relations. Trade continued even as political contacts were restricted. Within several years, as China's economic importance grew and memories faded from policy consideration, Western nations resumed normal relations despite absence of political reform or accountability for the violence. Economic interests and strategic calculations regarding China's role ultimately outweighed human rights concerns. The The Soviet Union, undergoing dramatic transformation under Gorbachev, offered muted response. Eastern European communist governments, several of which would fall within months, provided perfunctory support for Beijing while privately questioning whether violent suppression could succeed long-term. Within China, the government has maintained strict control over public discussion. The protests and crackdown are referred to obliquely if mentioned at all. Internet censorship blocks searches for terms related to Tiananmen, June 4th, or protest leaders. Each anniversary sees increased security in Beijing and detention of activists who attempt commemoration. Educational materials present sanitized accounts or omit the events entirely. This suppression has been effective in controlling domestic narrative. While many Chinese who lived through the events retain memories, detailed understanding among subsequent generations is limited. The government's ability to control information and shape historical memory represents one dimension of its response to the challenge. Hong Kong maintained annual vigils commemorating June 4th until recently. These gatherings attracted tens of thousands and served as the largest regular public remembrance under Chinese sovereignty. The national security law in 2020 effectively ended these vigils. Organizers were arrested. The vigil site has been closed on June 4th in recent years. What happened at Tiananmen Square in 1989 established patterns that defined China's subsequent development. The choice to suppress protests through military force rather than accommodate demands for political reform showed that the Communist Party would preserve its monopoly regardless of economic liberalization, international opinion, or domestic pressure. The crackdown demonstrated that massive sustained protest, even when peaceful and enjoying broad public support, could not force political change against a regime willing to employ military violence. The government's success in maintaining control while continuing economic development challenged assumptions that sustained growth would necessarily produce political liberalization. China's subsequent decades have followed this path. The country became the world's second-largest economy. Hundreds of millions were lifted from poverty. Technological advancement accelerated. International influence expanded. This occurred without the political opening many Western observers believed was necessary. Yet this has created its own contradictions. The surveillance state required to maintain control became increasingly sophisticated. Social credit systems, facial recognition, and comprehensive internet monitoring enable control at unprecedented scale. The party's legitimacy rests primarily on delivering economic growth and nationalist satisfaction rather than democratic accountability. What happens when economic growth slows or external challenges mount remains an open question that will shape China's future and global order. The Tiananmen protests revealed limits of popular resistance against determined authoritarian power. The students and workers who occupied the square believed moral clarity and peaceful protest would compel government response, or that international attention would provide protection. They discovered that neither prevents violence when regimes prioritize survival above legitimacy. This lesson has informed subsequent protest movements in China and elsewhere about the calculations required when confronting authoritarian systems. For the Chinese Communist Party, the successful suppression established a template. Rapid deployment of overwhelming force combined with comprehensive information control prevented the protests from spreading beyond Beijing to other major cities where similar demonstrations had begun. The party learned that decisive action, however brutal, could prevent the kind of cascading collapse that swept through Eastern Europe later that same year. Romania's violent revolution in December 1989 only reinforced this lesson. The difference between Prague's Velvet Revolution and Beijing's bloody suppression lay partly in the willingness to use maximum force without hesitation. The image of one man blocking tanks endures, because it captures both the courage of resistance and the disparity of power. The tanks stopped for him in that moment. They did not stop for the movement he symbolized. What is known is that the government he challenged survived, adapted, and strengthened its control. What happened at Tiananmen Square demonstrates how authoritarian regimes respond to challenges and shape historical memory. It shows that economic development and political repression can coexist, that international condemnation has limited effect when economic interests dominate, and that even massive peaceful protests can be suppressed when governments possess the will and means to employ force. The questions the protesters raised about corruption, accountability, and political participation remain unresolved in China's political system. The methods employed to suppress those questions, refined by technology, remain central to governance. The tension between economic dynamism and political rigidity that produced the protests persists, managed through control rather than resolved through reform. Whether this arrangement proves sustainable long-term remains among the most consequential questions facing the international system.